everyone, and welcome to Seeds of Hope, Regenerative Agriculture with Elena Garides. I'm your host, and this is episode number 4. On this podcast, join me on a journey across the regenerative agriculture ecosystem through conversations with farmers, founders, investors, and change makers as we learn how to create healthier soils, communities, and food. Today's episode is especially exciting as it's my first in-person interview for Seeds of Hope. I'm sitting down with Dr. Lanette Sobel, who will share her expertise on soil health, composting, and worm tea. We'll be discussing the fascinating intersection and sometimes contradictions of traditional agricultural education and permaculture, with a special focus on how plants take up nutrients. This conversation is particularly relevant because understanding how nature's systems work could hold the key to more sustainable and regenerative farming practices as we face impending global fertilizer shortages and mounting waste management challenges. Also, before we dive in, a quick heads up. We had a bit of a technical adventure during our recording where our camera decided to take an unexpected break partway through. While we lost some of the recording footage, the full audio conversation was captured perfectly, so you won't miss any of our fascinating discussion. Being able to have this conversation face-to-face brought an extra layer of depth to our discussion that I think you'll really enjoy. Let's dive in. Today I'm here with Dr. Lanette Sobel at Fertile Earth Worm Farm in Homestead, South Florida, and this is our first episode that we're recording in person. So welcome, Lanette. On your farm?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, we're in this giant shade structure here. It's a cool place to be. But it's really exciting. Lanette and I met a few months ago and have become friends. And Lanette is known as Miami's Queen of Compost here in South Florida. And she founded Fertile Earth Worm Farm in 2009. You're also a certified permaculturist, which seems to have been really important in your journey, and a certified commercial composter. In 2018, you earned your master's degree in forest pathology and a doctorate in plant medicine. And to kick us off, you're running one of the biggest commercial composting facilities in South Florida. And I imagine it maybe wasn't your childhood dream job. So how did you get into this? How did you get started?
Yeah. If somebody had told me 20 years ago that, hey, you'll be a worm farmer and you'll be doing this, I was like, what are you talking about? So yeah, I fell down the rabbit hole for sure. And I didn't even know how to grow a plant. I used to kill everything.
Yeah,
and
like house plants.
Yeah, I never had house plants, and when I did, they died if they stay with me too long. But I got into this because I'm a tree hugger. Even though I couldn't take care of trees, I definitely like to hug them. I grew up as an environmentalist. My dad was an environmentalist. He composted at home, although he did it badly, so my parents would squabble. My mom would throw out the food scraps. My dad would get mad. So he was a big influence, like in my life in general, especially when it came to respect for the environment. And also a big influence was a gifted and talented program in elementary school. And I remember being in 5th grade, and I remember them pulling me out of reading to teach me about acid rain. And I'm like, why are they...
In 5th grade?
In 5th grade. It's like, why are you teaching about acid rain? And then years later, I was like, oh, I get it. All right, cool. You know, that worked. It makes sense.
What kind of program was that?
It was a gifted and talented program that, I don't know if it was maybe 2 hours a week that they pulled you out and they taught you about different topics. And the topics were related to the environment for the most part.
I love that.
Yeah.
That is a little bit surprising. I feel like in my education, that wasn't a big part of the curriculum.
For sure. And it wasn't part of mine either. Like if I hadn't been in the gifted and talented program, I wouldn't have been exposed to it. Like none of my other classmates got exposure to that.
So from a really early age, you got exposed to those pretty complex and maybe sometimes heavy issues that we're facing around the environment. And then you had your home environment where you learn to love nature and learn from your dad. So how did that then lead you to your next steps?
I got involved in sustainability consulting before that was even a thing. So you couldn't go to a university to get a degree in it at that point. So I did I was a visiting researcher with Dr. Daniel Miroff, who is now, I think he's an assistant dean now, but he's a professor at Florida Atlantic University. And he was the the expert in this climate zone in terms of greening hotels. So I worked with him for a year with this project to determine best practices for greening hotels. I thought that's what I wanted to do for a long time. It was really fun. I would, go to countries in the Caribbean and audit like Club Meds and the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos and things like that. And but what happened was that when I was with Dr. Miroff, we did waste audits. And for whatever reason, I was so excited that the night before the waste audits, I couldn't sleep. And we found that there was 1 ton of organic material per hotel room coming out of Miami Beach. At the time, there was 20,000 hotel rooms.
Per hotel room
per year. So 1 ton of organic matter. So that included any kind of like leaves, mulch, and landscaping debris, but also food. And
that's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. And so I started to look into, okay, let's send it to the highest and best use. And when I looked into it, we only had 2 options, landfill or incinerate. So I decided to create another option. And that was to compost it. And that, to me, had a lot more value than getting a hotel or green certification. That a lot of times I would go back to the same hotel and they were back to doing business as usual. Mm-hmm. And I'm only on planet Earth for a limited period of time. And to me, that's wasting my time because I care.
You don't just want to do it on paper.
Yeah, I actually really care. So, why waste my time? So collecting the food, I actually see the food. I actually see the results of what we do. I see the compost. I see because of my efforts, because of my team's efforts, because I can't do this by myself. There's no way. Because of our efforts, what we're able to do, what we're able to pull out of the landfill. So to me, that was just a natural switch, moving over to composting. So I can just feel fulfilled more than anything else. And then once I started making compost, then I started growing. Because I had all this compost, I still didn't know what the hell I was doing. But little by little, I was like, I figured, okay, it all comes down to the soil. And eventually, I decided to go back to school and get a degree in agriculture. But I studied permaculture first.
Okay, so you did that while you were already involved with the compost?
Yes, after I started worm farming. And that whole thing completely evolved on its own because I never asked to teach anybody how to worm farm. I basically read some books. And I had worms living underneath my kitchen sink because I didn't have a balcony and I have a backyard. I lived in South Beach in an apartment. And little by little, people were like, that's really cool. Can you come teach? So it just started snowballing on its own. And all of a sudden I was teaching. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'm teaching. Then I learned about permaculture because I was never into agriculture. It didn't make sense to me. The way that we did commercial agriculture with these humongous 1,000+ acre fields of the same crop and dousing them in chemicals, it never sat right with me. But then I got exposed to permaculture and was like, this makes sense. I jive with this. Mm-hmm. The idea of working with nature, the idea of using ancient wisdom, ancient cultures knew how to grow these things in all sorts of very precarious environments. My background is half my family's Peruvian. So growing in the Andes and where they terraced these mountainsides and they controlled the water flow, and it was just
permaculture.
It made sense.
Its finest.
Yeah, it's about working with nature, not against her. So I brought that into grad school, and I went to a land grant school.
So before we go into that, maybe can you explain briefly what permaculture is for any of the listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Mm-hmm. So it stands for permanent agriculture, or you could say permanent culture. There's a flower usually if you see the permaculture flower, because it's not just about agriculture. It's about different things. It's about the economy, how we work. It's about community. It's about how we not only grow things, but how we build things, the building materials that we use. It's this whole system where it's really about working with nature instead of against her. So you follow the same steps that nature would, except that you can accelerate it. Say a parking lot. You can regenerate that into a fully functional forest that maybe it would have taken nature 50 to 100 years, but you can do it in maybe 2 to 5, maybe 10 years doing a permaculture because you're just helping it along. So it's a very different system than what we have. Yeah. And for instance, like it's very even different from organic, a lot of organic farms, a lot of organic systems. Because if you take a drone shot of an organically certified farm, a lot of times it's going to look the same as a conventional farm.
Yeah.
The difference is the chemicals that they use. But a permaculture farm will look very different. You know, instead of monocrops, they love diversity. Intercropping. Also, there's 7 different layers, for instance. So instead of just having one crop on the ground, you have everything from ground covers to like shrubs, to small trees, to large trees, to bigger trees, to vines. And you can grow so much in a much smaller space. So it's definitely a better use of our resources, and it's much more productive than our conventional agricultural systems.
Yeah. I love that it's a whole system that maybe mirrors the complexity of the natural system.
Yeah.
Where there's different layers, different species growing together, and also integrated with the human species, so our built environment. Thanks for explaining that. So you took that background, seeing the problem with waste, getting into composting and worm farming, which I had actually never heard about worm farming before I met you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
I am so honored to introduce it to you.
You're the first worm farmer in my life. I had the pleasure also of seeing your worm farm. And so you took all this background, permaculture, learning about soil, into your master's and PhD studies.
Yeah, and so I came from a super different background than what most people came from. And also my undergrad was in finance. I was looking for schools. I went up to UF and I did a tour, and one of the girls had a bachelor's in organic agriculture from the University of Maine. And she was like, I think it's okay to use fertilizers, and they're like more open to it. I was like, okay, I'll stay open to it too. And to be honest, I'm probably more hardcore now than I ever was. After getting exposed to like the type of chemicals that we use in agriculture, the way that we do agriculture makes no effing sense to me. No, but that's what we're taught. And so, for instance, I wanted to take a soil microbiology class. I was in grad school for 5.5 years, and there was never a professor there to teach it to me.
Yeah, and you said that you even talked to your professor, right? Asking for.
Yeah, so I remember I was in an environmental nutrient management class, and they're teaching you how to use like the conventional fertilizers, your ureas, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, and application rates. And phosphorus is a problem in agriculture. Like one of the professors even said that we're going to run out of phosphorus before we run out of oil. And that's one of the macronutrients that plants need. So if you see a bag of conventional fertilizer, it has NPK on it. The P stands for phosphorus. So there's 17 essential plant nutrients, according to science. I think there's more.
I was just going to say, sounds simplified.
Yeah, but according to science, there's 17. And there's 3 macronutrients, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then there's 3 secondary nutrients. The rest are micronutrients. And that's all they say that we need. But phosphorus is definitely important. And I remember I knew that mycorrhizae, which is a type of fungus that creates these symbiotic relationships with the plants, I knew that plants could fetch phosphorus with the mycorrhizae. So I asked the professor, so what about mycorrhizae? And he had 0 idea what mycorrhizae even was. And
which is pretty shocking when you're teaching plant nutrition.
Yeah, but it's because he was trained only in conventional. He was a good enough professor to say, hey, you know, I don't know about that.
Right.
But I think I know somebody who does. And he brought in another professor that only taught like a short course on mycorrhizae. And then I ended up taking that professor's 1-week short course. But there was very little information that I was able to get out of my programs that had to do with the type of agriculture I was interested in, which was not the conventional stuff. It's about the soil. It's about the soil, stupid. You know, it's because plants, they have what they need. Like, they have their own plant defenses, but they need those building blocks in the soil to make those secondary metabolites. And if they don't have those, then the plant's in trouble.
So in the podcast, I'm on a mission to understand our whole food system better, to understand the agriculture component, how we eat, how we process the food, and then how we build soil. And so it's almost like a circle. So how does composting fit into this? How does composting fit into soil health?
Compost is the basis, I think, of all the solutions. I might be biased, you know, but I really think that is the basis. That's the basis of organic agriculture. Nobody fertilizes a forest, right? Nobody needs to go into a forest and fertilize it. Nature recycles the nutrients. So let me take the example of the phosphorus. There is naturally occurring phosphorus in the soil. There's naturally occurring phosphorus in the compost. It's a very small amount. Mm-hmm. So in our compost, for instance, when we do our analysis, it's usually 111 or less. So 1% or less of the actual compost has phosphorus in it. But when you buy the conventional fertilizer, it might be 10, 20, 10. I've seen crazy things, 20, 50, 30, like very, very, very high amounts of nutrients. And so back to a natural system, the phosphorus is there. The issue is the plant can't access the phosphorus.
It's not bioavailable.
It's not available to the plants. It's not plant available. They need mycorrhizae or other symbiotic organisms to make those nutrients plant available. So the plant will actually send out signals in the soil and be like, hey, everybody, I need this nutrient. And then the microorganisms will go fetch it for them. And in exchange, the plant provides sugars. So it's a symbiotic relationship. They both benefit. And then when you think about it, mycorrhizae, it's a fungus. And if you know about fungi can create these very, very long strands. Their body is hyphae.
The mycelium?
Yes. So it can travel for miles. The largest organism on the world that we know of is a fungus.
My mind was blown when I first watched the Fantastic Fungi Netflix documentary. The networks that they build also between plants and even between different forests.
Exactly. So if you imagine like a plant, I mean, they have roots, right? But the roots will only go so far. Mm-hmm. Usually most of the roots are within the drip line of the plant. But mycorrhizae can go for miles. It fetches water, it fetches phosphorus, and also nitrogen-fixing bacteria fixes nitrogen from the air and makes the plant available. So it's these microorganisms that are the real heroes. They're the secret sauce. Like I could say I do a lot of things. Like lately, I just say I'm a micro farmer because that's really who does the work, or the microbes. Like I don't really do much. I just set up the conditions for the microbes to do their thing.
So how do traditional fertilizers become available to the plants? Is the phosphorus processed in a certain way?
Yes. So phosphorus, they have to make it soluble. In compost, it's insoluble. So, and it doesn't move like well or fast. Like it's pretty much like locked into the soil. But when you have to make it plant available, like for instance, in that class, we would calculate fertilizer applications for pastures or whatever. And
so how much a farmer might need to grow X amount of specific crop.
Yeah. And we always would have to calculate a 40% runoff. Because we knew
40%.
Yeah. We knew that it was about 40% that was going to run off straight off the bat. If there was a rain event, it could be 80%.
Those numbers are huge, especially considering how expensive fertilizer can be.
And not only expensive, how detrimental it is, especially when you have water bodies around. So that's a huge difference. One stays put, the other one is very soluble, runs off. But so to take the example of phosphorus, and I didn't even know about this until the Piney Point disaster. Did you ever hear about that? It was in Tampa.
Can you explain what it
So
was?
there was a rock phosphate mining company. You take it from its natural form, and then through a process that creates a radioactive byproduct, they create this soluble phosphorus. But they don't know what to do with it, this radioactive material. So they keep them in basically these holding cells, these holding tanks, and the wall of this one humongous holding tank collapsed. And all of a sudden, this radioactive material flooded this whole area of Tampa. So now you have radioactive material that's in the bay. And what happened? That company had been defunct a long time ago. Who pays for cleaning up that mess? It wasn't that company, it's us. That's how we do it in conventional agriculture. We make it soluble, there's a radioactive byproduct, and things like that happen. And I was actually really worried because this last hurricane that came, it was headed straight towards Tampa again. So I think it's only a matter of time.
And now we also have the incinerators, which are classified as renewable energy,
which is a
in
bunch
Florida.
of BS.
And we had the one burned down in Doral, and now they're thinking about where to put the next one. So there is clearly a problem of what to do with our waste. How do you see the governmental organizations like the state or the county or the city, are they considering alternatives like composting in their waste management plans?
I guess it depends on who you talk to. I don't think they're serious about it, to be honest, because I'm a big fan of the mayor that we have right now. I think she's very progressive, and I think she's the best mayor Miami-Dade County has had in a really long time. But there's still something off. You know, she created a zero waste task force, which is great, but you can't have zero waste without composting. 60% of everything we send to the incinerator is compostable. Food is 20 to 25%, and then when you add in the yard debris, when you add in the paper and the cardboard, that makes up 60%. And the last thing you want to burn is wet food. Food's a resource. All of these materials are resources, and they can be pretty easily converted into something that we need, because anybody who lives in South Florida knows that if they've ever tried to plant a tree and they've dug into the ground, they hit rock right away. We're a bed of coral rock for the most part. We need soil. We have one of the largest nursery industries in the country. We import soil. We import peat moss from Lithuania and Canada, you know, like these bogs that are not renewable, that take millions of years to form, that are these humongous carbon sinks. We're extracting that and using it to grow plants. But back to Miami-Dade County, for instance, 2 years ago, we were asked to be part of a grant that was supposed to change the regulations in terms of like composting here in Miami-Dade, make it more accessible, jumpstart the industry. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. So they received this grant, and we started on this grant. And part of it was that Durham needed to come onto our properties, and Durham is the Department of Environmental and Regulatory Management, so they're the environmental watchdogs. And we were supposed to work with them to change the regulations. Anyway, what ended up happening is they gave the other composter that was in Miami-Dade a cease and desist order, and we continued because, well, I know what I'm doing. And then they gave the money back to the U.S. government.
Oh.
Yeah, so they shut down the program, and then they give back the money. So it's like, what the hell is going on? And I never received any letter, any communication in writing from the county as to why they did that. So I still am not sure what the problem was. So to me, there is something going on. I didn't realize how political like composting was until I got into this. But if you think about it, like composting, we're in the waste industry. We're in the agriculture industry primarily, but some people might consider us also being in the waste industry. And a lot of people make money in waste. Billions of dollars go into our waste systems. I think it's very political. I think there's definitely like special interests that want to keep things status quo. I feel like there's some interest in doing this, but the majority of the interest is in setting up an incinerator again.
Which is wild, especially considering the detrimental health effects of breathing in incinerated air.
For sure.
So I know it's a huge movement.
You know, I did a tour of the old Smoky in Coconut Grove. And just the rates of cancer in that community is insane.
Yeah, we were actually looking into a project there to remediate some of the soil because there's still large amounts of heavy metals, PFAS present. And so a lot of the soil has been paved over because it's extremely expensive to take it all out, ship it to a landfill, and bring in new soil. So we were looking into phytoremediation options, different plants that can absorb heavy metals. PFAS is a big challenge.
Yeah.
Harder to break down with natural remedies.
Yeah.
But let's take a really quick break.
Okay.
Because the sun is coming out.
Okay.
As we started recording again, I couldn't take my eyes off of the beautiful fig tree that was right behind us that you could see in the video in the beginning of the episode. This is one of the healthiest trees I've seen.
Well,
it seems it has some predators.
So there was a caterpillar that was attacking this really badly, and it was a much smaller tree. And so we started adding the worm tea, and it just went.
Worm tea seems to be the magic potion. I remember you telling me a story of an orange tree you had in a front yard, and it was befallen by, what was it, a fungus?
Citrus greening, the Asian citrus psyllid.
And that's affected many of Florida's orange, most of Florida's orange.
Most of our industry, yeah.
Right.
So I was adding worm tea, and I wish we would do more research with things like worm tea, because citrus is a huge industry in Florida. and it has been decimated by the citrus greening. Absolutely decimated. There's always something that controls something else in nature. And the reason why I think the tea works really well is because in citrus greening, what ends up happening is that the vascular system that transport nutrients to the rest of the tree from the roots is compromised. It can no longer really transport the nutrients up to the tree. But when you apply the tea foliarly, the leaves can absorb nutrients.
You apply it onto the leaves?
Yeah. So you apply it onto the leaves. You also apply it to the soil. You apply it everywhere. So the leaves all of a sudden can absorb the nutrients. And so it doesn't matter if the root system's compromised. The leaves are getting the nutrients they need.
What is worm tea?
Worm tea. So worm tea is a liquid. It's not for drinking, although I will admit I have drank some.
What does it taste like?
Kombucha. It literally tasted like kombucha.
That's pretty yummy.
Yeah.
People pay good money for kombucha.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's, different compost tastes a little different. But anyway, so the whole point is that it's really for trees. It's really for your plants. And what we do is we take worm castings, which is probably the best known organic fertilizer on the planet, and we put it in a big tea bag.
And worm castings is?
Worm poop. Worm manure, yes.
Okay.
It's our fancy name for worm manure. And so we'll put in these big tea bags and we'll put in these big brewers and we'll basically inject water into the system. So we have these huge vortex brewers at my partner's farm, which is Alliance Farm. So the air is being infused in high amounts into this water, and there's a lot of microorganisms, beneficial microorganisms in the worm castings. And so basically we're increasing their populations exponentially by injecting the air. So this is basically a really beneficial microbial soup. And in addition, there's minerals in the tea. And there's naturally occurring phytohormones like cytokinins and auxins that promote fruiting and flowering. So this tea ends up being an all-natural fertilizer. It ends up promoting fruiting and flowering. And it's also a pest repellent. Because if you think about it, when we have an issue with our crops or plants in general, it's because something got out of balance. You have this Asian citrus psyllid, but there's nothing controlling it. But in nature, there's always a fungi that eats a nematode. The nematodes eat the bacteria. The bacteria, they attack the microarthropods. It's this whole soil food web. And a lot of times, I don't know what the hell's going on. I really don't, because there's so many different interactions happening. There's so many different microbes in the tea. But what ends up happening is that there's something in there, if not many things in there, that end up controlling what's out of control, and it brings it back into balance. So that's how it acts as a pest repellent. We're not killing anything. It's not a pesticide. Anything with a side at the end is meant to kill. And in conventional agriculture, their philosophy is kill, 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 kill. And our philosophy is the opposite. Add, 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 add. So if you got a plant that has an issue, add beneficial microorganisms to it, and then it'll control it. Versus in a bad conventional system, they'll do broad spectrum, so they'll kill everything off. And then hope and pray that the right microorganisms come back first. Because if they don't, then you have another infestation, potentially the same thing or a different thing. But the cycle just keeps continuing like that. I bought a nursery, and I really didn't know anything about the nursery industry before I bought this nursery. We have one of the largest nursery industries in the country.
In Florida.
Right here in Miami-Dade County. We're one of the only places that can actually grow palm trees year-round outdoors. So we export plants all over the world. I know people in the industry, and they're having a lot of trouble controlling diseases. And these are ornamental plants for the most part, but they're applying chemicals so often that say they apply a chemical that has a 2-day, no reentry period, 48-hour no reentry period. And then they go back, they see, oh, it still has this. They apply again. They don't even have time to take care of the plants. And then it goes into these big box retailers, and then you have consumers taking these plants into the house thinking they're healthy, and they're doused with chemicals. So I actually know some people in the industry that they will not touch a plant that's in a Home Depot. They cringe when they see people smelling the flowers because they know how toxic those plants are. And actually, out of all places, Walmart's putting pressure on the nursery industry to grow plants with less chemicals. So there is pressure, and most likely that pressure probably comes from the consumer, and the consumers are waking up and putting pressure on these big box retailers that hopefully will put the pressure on the nurseries to start cutting back on this chemical usage. Because one nursery I know spends $90,000 a week
A week.
a week on pesticides.
Wow. So I imagine that part of the challenge for nurseries is that a lot of nurseries grow their plants in individual pots.
Mm-hmm.
Can they still create a thriving microbiome in each pot that could support the plant?
They can. And I mean, shoot, it all starts with the soil, right? So if you use living soil, for instance, I make a soil blend. It's a living soil blend for cannabis. And if you look online, how to grow cannabis, there's all sorts of crazy things people do. pH up, pH down, they're constantly adding things. This is plant the seed, mind the lights and the water and forget about it, basically. Because everything's there already.
When you say soil blend, what do you mean by
so
that?
it's mostly compost and castings. Depends on my mix, but it might have like 13 other, soil amendments. So I might have bone meal, or I might have blood meal, probably kelp meal. I'll have trace minerals. Sometimes I'll add certain strains of mycorrhizae, in particular the living soil mix, which freaks people out sometimes because it's alive. So we were selling to this hydroponics supply store, and we got a complaint from someone that says, oh my God, there's things moving in here. You want things moving in there. Like you want it to be alive. But in contrast, the majority of what most growers in general are supposed to are inert ingredients that are not alive. So the peat moss, not alive. Coconut coir, not alive. Perlite, not alive. Vermiculite, not alive. So you have this very sterile medium that growers like to use because there's nothing good in there, but there's also nothing bad in there. To me, it all comes down to the soil. Like I said, it's all about the soil, stupid.
So you're working now with some of these nurseries here in South Florida?
Yeah.
In Miami-Dade County?
We need to work more with them, but yes.
Are you supplying them with their soils? Are you doing experiments?
We do want to get into a little bit more R&D. Back in the day, even before I went to grad school, we were working with nurseries, and it was a very different environment because there was no pressure on them to change their practices. So we have a long way to go in terms of the nursery industry. And so that's why I tend to focus more on edibles at the moment, but there's a lot of opportunity with the nursery industry, especially in terms of controlling plant diseases and creating less toxic plants for our community.
And potential cost savings for the nurseries.
A lot of potential cost savings for nurseries. You don't need to spend $90,000.
We've also talked about the culture, this idea of, okay, you want to go organic for certain reasons, but the how might still be quite difficult. How do you approach that with potential clients? The people who approach you usually already fully bought in, they know what they need and want to do, or is there an educational component?
No, there's a huge educational component. Because like I said, I went to a land-grant university. Land-grant university are the universities that were created to teach people about agriculture. But the way that we've been taught ever since World War II has all focused on chemicals. To me, it's just a much more simple system. When you talk about growing a plant, I don't have to worry about that. I have to be super careful about the nutrients that I add, and I have to do all these calculations about the runoff, and then, then the plant has issues with pests or whatever it is, and then I have to control that too. And to me, it's so much more complicated to do conventional than it is to do organic, the way that we do it. Because in organic soil, the plant takes care of itself.
That actually reminds me of this conversation I had with a friend a few years ago about what if we could control our organs? What if we could control when we digest food and what happens at certain times? And our bodies are such complex systems. We would never be able to manage everything that's going on. So just drawing that parallel, trying to control all of these complex relationships, interactions with plants and their soils and the whole life in the soil. Oh, it's an impossible task.
Yeah, it's like, let nature do her thing. She knows what she's doing. She's been doing this way longer than we have. And so we come in there thinking we're smarter than nature, or we can control nature, maybe for a little bit. But in the grand scheme of things, we can't. We have this green revolution where all the yields increased or whatever. Now they're going back down again.
So the Green Revolution, counterintuitively, is the chemical revolution, let's say, right?
It's really the chemical revolution. Yes.
So for any listeners who haven't heard of the Green Revolution before, I was quite surprised that was the name it was given.
Yeah, that's when chemical fertilizers were invented. But nature already had her system. We don't have to use fossil fuels to extract nitrogen from the air. The microbes do that. We have nitrogen fixing bacteria that does that. There's this whole nitrogen cycle that happens in a healthy system. We forgot about that. And why do we forget about that? Well, because we had a excessive amount of explosives after World War II. It's like, what do you do with that? Oh, wait, nitrogen. We can use that to grow trees. Let's do that. I do not want anything to do with chemicals. Having had a lot more background and knowledge about what those effects are toxicologically. I eat all organic, at least as much as I can. I don't like to eat out because I feel like I know a little bit too much about the food system, you know? I ask a lot of questions when I go to restaurants. My friends get embarrassed, you know? I know the detrimental effects of these chemicals. Like, why would I expose myself or my daughter to that? So my plan is I want to grow everything myself, but we'll get there.
Absolutely. One step at a time. For now, you have South Florida's biggest commercial composting business. I'm curious to bring it back to that. What are some of the ways that you see your business grow? What are some of the challenges that you see?
Man, I think there's a lot of opportunity, especially if the politicians want to get behind it and support it. We don't have to keep doing business as usual. We have this take, make, waste society. It's this linear system. Landfills are holding cells for future generations. They're issues for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. Those landfills are one of the biggest contributors to methane gas emissions in the world. Years ago, the EPA said that if landfills were a country, they'd be the third largest emitter of methane gas after the United States and China. That's humongous. And since then, we have new technology that's been able to actually see the methane emissions coming from landfills, and it's worse than we thought. And why is there methane coming from landfills? Do you know?
I don't.
The food.
Is it composting in an anaerobic way? Is that the
Yes.
problem?
Well, it's not even called composting yet, but it's breaking down anaerobically. Anaerobic means no oxygen. So when you have an environment that has no oxygen, things, one, they decompose super slow. But two, the byproduct ends up being methane, which is considered up to 80 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So when you drive by our only mountains in Florida, our landfills, in case you're not from Florida or never been.
It's very flat here.
But if you drive by one of our mountains, like you smell that very distinct smell, that's the methane. The other issue with putting food into landfills is that they block out moisture. You know, typically in a landfill, they'll add a layer of something like fill dirt or mulch, and that's to block out the air and the oxygen. And so the only moisture that's really in the landfill comes from the food, which trickles down, picks up heavy metals and toxins, creates a toxic soup called leachate that, again, we don't know what to do with. Like, again, it affects our water supplies. There's a plastic liner in modern landfills that's supposed to keep what's inside, but they have lifespans too. Plastic liners last about 50 years before they start breaking down. Incinerators are not the solution. Landfills are not the solution. We need soil here. We have no soil. Everybody needs it. That's the way nature intended. There's better options. Composting is what nature intended.
It's closing the circle
It's closing
of
the loop.
nutrients.
You know, when you talk about circular economies, you cannot have a circular economy without composting.
Yeah. Because we're growing plants, we harvest those, we take away the nutrients these plants have taken from the soil, and then we need to return them.
Exactly. It's a cycle.
So we do also probably need compost toilets.
Absolutely.
That is
I love
another...
composting toilets. We have some on the farm.
Yes, we actually also have one at our house. But yeah, so you're working with certain companies down here, and they are privately composting with you. And I remember you've told me sometimes you get a whole truckload of papayas or even meats that just aren't fit anymore to be sent around the country. And you compost that, and then that compost can go back to the soil.
Exactly. We have a regular slew of clients, which includes hospitals, grocery stores like Whole Foods Market, includes arenas, Miami Heat. The Miami Marlins was actually our first client, restaurants in general. But we also work with food distributors. And so we'll get maybe 20 tons of papaya at a time, 50 tons of onions, 3 tons of rambutan, 15,000 pounds of meat, like whole roasting pigs. And a lot of times, like the fruit that we get is just too ripe to ship. It's perfectly good. There's nothing wrong with it. We'll get this huge shipment, and maybe 5%, 10% actually needs to get composted, and the rest can feed people. So there's an incredible amount of waste in the systems, because how many trees, how many nutrients did it take to grow 20 tons of papaya? For what? For us to compost it?
Right. So you actually also donate some of the food.
Yeah, so our objective is to send food to the highest and best use. So the highest and best use is to feed people. followed by animals, followed by make soil. So when we get those shipments, we make calls out to Farm Share and Feeding South Florida and other local food banks, and even just the people, just our friends. Follow us on Instagram. And I think it makes the most sense.
I agree. Plus, who wouldn't want some delicious ripe papaya? So in your mind, to close out, what could the future look like if we composted those 60% of compostable waste that we create instead of it going to landfills, instead of it going to incinerators?
Oh my God, we'd have better air quality. You know, we're not burning the stuff, we're not landfilling it, we're helping protect us against climate change because of the lower methane emissions. Another super important thing is the water. We have a very sensitive ecosystem here, and we have beautiful water. That's one of the reasons why I like living in Miami. You go and you see this beautiful blue water, but we have fish kills every once in a while now. And why do we have fish kills? It's these chemical fertilizers are running off. A lot of them because of homeowners. There's a huge part that, yes, is coming from ag, and that's this whole other beast that we have to address. But homeowners have way more power than we think we do. It's all about education. But a lot of times people think, let me just add more. More is better. And they end up killing their lawn because more is not better. And then, as I said before, those nutrients are running off. And they're causing these algae blooms that are sucking up all the oxygen. The fish are dying.
So this vision of
clean water. Clean water. I want clean water. I don't, our seagrass, before I went to grad school, never heard a thing about seagrass. I came back 7 years later, it's like, our seagrasses are dying, our seabeds are dying. And that's the basis of that ecosystem. So the whole ecosystem's collapsing. Why? It's because of the stuff you and I are buying. You know, not just applying to our lawns, but we're buying in the stores. Consumers have like way more power than we, I think, realize that we do. But just by composting in general, oh my God, cleaner water, healthier soil, healthier food, healthier people. We have a community garden back here. The food tastes better. Not only is it healthier, not only does it has more nutrients in it, it's more, you know, it's more packed with minerals. It doesn't have harmful chemicals in it that cause cancer.
If nothing else can convince someone, clean water, clean air, I think we all love delicious tasting food that's good for us, good for the planet.
Come taste our tomatoes when they're ready.
Just text me and I'll be right here. I love that vision, and thank you for working so hard on your part to bringing that to life. Is there anything else you want to share as we close out the episode?
I want to say composting is not hard. It's something everybody can do, and I find super empowering. Nobody needs to wait for a company like me to take your food. Everyone can do it. Doesn't matter if you live on a farm or in a tiny apartment in South Beach. If you got room underneath your kitchen sink, you can do it. To me, it's very empowering. You know, everyone can make a difference, and this is a small but super important step that all of us can do to actually make a positive difference. It's just compost and just compost your own stuff. And support those that compost. And ask everybody that you buy from, hey, do you compost? Hey, why not? Just start asking questions, like raise awareness, learn. We just need to raise awareness about what's going on, and the change will happen.
I started composting last year. It's been
awesome.
Super fun to see how quickly my food scraps turn into soil.
Yeah.
And I also was lucky enough to get some of your worms. And there's definitely this myth, I think, that people have that composting is dirty and it smells, and I don't want that underneath my kitchen sink or even in my backyard.
Yes. Totally wrong. It should never smell. If it's smelling, you're doing it wrong. And that's the issue my mom and my dad had. But to that point, we actually have our first art exhibition. So now we're artists. So there's a exhibition called the Wonder Gardens. And we are actually composting inside the art gallery.
Wow.
Yeah. So all the food scraps that get produced from all the events, we have a big worm bin. And there's actually a movie called Lanette Sobel. It's a documentary that has won so many awards internationally that they'll be showing on the wall cast. So the worms are there, and the whole idea is, it's so gross, it's so nasty. So no, it's happening right in front of your eyes. You see it happening. It does not smell. You know, you don't have flies. You can do it indoors. So that's the whole point. Just raise awareness about the soil. What's really cool is I've never seen art actually made out of compost. And there's little earthworms everywhere. It's just the cutest thing. Cool.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Lanette.
Thank
we
you.
covered so much ground, and your wealth of knowledge. I can see how much you care.
Yay.
So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Seeds of Hope. Our wonderful theme music is composed by Dane Myers. If you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Share it with a friend who might find it inspiring. And if you're loving the podcast, we'd be grateful if you could leave a rating and review on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It really helps others discover us. See you next time, and thanks again.